Inclusive excellence is the recognition that in order to remain competitive in an increasingly global and diverse society, UB must have a workforce for the 21st century. We must value diversity and be conscious of difference across race, gender, disability, and other factors that really promote varied viewpoints. In faculty hiring, inclusive excellence requires purposeful and informed strategies to really look at our search processes and to scrutinize them to make sure that we're not inadvertently screening out excellent and qualified candidates. It really requires us to look at what we're doing to make sure that we're not merely cloning ourselves. So what I'm going to be talking about are the legal restrictions in terms of searches and how we can navigate those at the same time to make sure that we are recruiting for diversity. Affirmative action is a term that's been a subject of a lot of controversy and that's really been misunderstood. As a federal contractor, UB is subject to federal affirmative action requirements. These requirements simply require us to make extraordinary efforts to recruit and retain a diverse applicant pool, and also to make sure that we're not discriminating in terms of how we treat our employees. So let's talk about what affirmative action does not do. Affirmative action does not require UB to hire unqualified candidates. Affirmative action does not allow UB to give preference to candidates based on race, sex, disability, or other factors. And affirmative action does not require quotas. What it does require that UB do is be very conscious of our applicant pools, who we're hiring, and to track that information. Affirmative action requirements do mandate that federal contractors like UB ensure equal opportunity in employment, promotions, demotions or transfers, recruitment or recruitment advertising, layoff or termination, rates of pay or other forms of compensation, and selection for training, including apprenticeships. Affirmative action requirements are particularly important when there is an underutilization of employees in certain demographic groups within a department. And I'll explain what that means. Let's say for an entry-level staff position, you might expect that the pool of qualified candidates would meet the general demographics of the area in terms of what's required. That would basically tell you that if you have only a very small percentage of female employees within that job group, that you're underutilized. For faculty, it's a little bit more complicated because we know that, for example, within the mechanical engineer field, you might not have 50% of the population who's qualified for a faculty position as a mechanical engineer. What my office does is look at field-specific information to be able to tell, predictably how many women might we expect would be qualified for this position, how many minorities. And we can help departments to determine, is my applicant pool really matching what we could expect to see? You could contact the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the early part of the search for utilization numbers, really to make sure that your efforts are on track. Identifying the right search committee is extremely important in our diversity efforts. The search committee is the first public face of UB that most candidates see. And for that reason, it is really important to identify a diverse group of faculty to sit on that search committee. The search committee should be composed of a diverse group of members, and individual search committee members should be well respected within the department, should be able to accommodate the time commitment that the search process requires, and should be able to convey a positive impression of the department and of UB. A lack of diversity, particularly within the search committee, can create a negative impression of the department and the university, and it can also contribute to unconscious bias in the selection process. But there's a real tension there as well, because what a department chair does not want to do is overload minority and women faculty members, particularly junior ones, with a lot of service obligations that might get in the way of research. So it's important to be cognizant of that when selecting a search committee. UB conducted interviews of new faculty members to hear about what their impressions were of UB through the search committee process. One new female faculty member told us that through her entire search process, she didn't meet a single woman on the search committee, through campus visits, through dinners, and it really created a negative impression of the university. This was true even though there were female faculty in her department. She reported that this nearly led to a decision not to select UB. A job description is a very important part of recruiting faculty members, and we don't think about job descriptions in the recruitment context, but the words we place in that job description really can shape our pool in terms of who decides to apply for the position. It's really important when developing the job description really to scrutinize all of the criteria to make sure that they're truly necessary. Sometimes a broader job description will really give us a much more diverse applicant pool. We want to make sure that any qualifications we have in there are truly necessary. An important consideration when developing the job description is to make sure that the description itself is not discriminatory. And I'll give you an example of how this can happen. Let's imagine that you have a position that requires that a faculty member travel to various locations throughout New York State. And many of these locations are not easily accessible through public transportation. So the job description says that the person has to have a valid New York State driver's license. It may not seem discriminatory on its face, but when we really consider that, anybody who's blind or might not be able to drive due to a condition such as epilepsy would be barred from having that position. We need to really think about what is the essential function? What do we need that person to be able to achieve? And what we need them to achieve is the ability to attend meetings throughout New York State. We don't care if they drive their own car or if they have assistance through somebody in their life to drive them there. We really want to make sure that they meet that essential qualification, and we can frame that in a non-discriminatory way. When interviewing candidates, it's important to plan to make sure that the interview experience is consistent for each candidate. Make sure that you understand how much time that you have so that the interview isn't rushed. Keep in mind that questions will lead to follow-up questions, and so it may be better to limit the number of questions at the beginning or else front-load the questions that are most important at the beginning to make sure that the candidates cover these. In terms of ensuring functional diversity, it's also a good idea to include some questions about cultural competence. What experience does the candidate have, for example, working with diverse groups of students? That candidate's answer will tell you a lot in terms of how they can navigate cultural challenges. It's also important to remember that this will be the candidate's first impression of the campus, and it's important for the search committee itself to create a good impression. We're not just assessing the candidate, but we're knowing that the candidate is also going to be assessing us. So we want to be welcoming and positive. Be punctual, be attentive. Be prepared. Make sure that we know about the candidate, their background and credentials. That'll really demonstrate that we're interested in that candidate. We can be straightforward about the challenges at UB. If there are challenges with the position or the department, we don't need to lie about those, but it's important not to speak negatively about the position, the department, about UB, or about the previous incumbent who held the job. Through the interview process, it's also important to remember that some questions are illegal. Questions about disability and marital status are expressly prohibited by law. Other questions involving things like race, national origin, or religion, or other protected factors like that are considered impermissible and do not belong in the search process. One area that's a challenge for search committees is what to do when an applicant with a visible disability arrives and asks for an accommodation. It's important to understand that the search committee cannot ask the applicant questions about their disability, but at the same time, we are required to provide accommodations. If you encounter that situation, contact the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion because we can help you provide an accommodation for the applicant while at the same time preserving their confidentiality. It's also very important to understand that we can't make assumptions that somebody with a disability can't perform a certain job. While we can't ask about the disability, we can ask about essential functions of the job and ask how the applicant would perform that position. It's also very important to remember that the same restrictions that we have in interview settings also apply to less formal settings, like off-campus dinners and events. And I think this can be particularly challenging for members of search committees. It's socially very normal in informal settings to ask about things like somebody's family. And these are questions that we're still not allowed to ask. When ranking candidates, search committees should keep in mind that, again, we're not allowed to consider factors such as race, gender, national origin, disability, veteran status, or other categories. The search committee should document its recommendation and rationale. If a hiring decision is challenged in court, all search committee notes will be discoverable. Therefore, they should relate solely to job-related factors. Even casual comments or notes in the margins of candidate assessments may be grounds for a discrimination finding if they indicate the decision was made for a discriminatory reason. Balancing the goals of recruiting for diversity, at the same time making sure that we comply with legal requirements, can definitely be a challenge, and you're not without help in the university. We recommend that you contact the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion if you have compliance-related questions so that we can guide and assist you.